Climate-smart agriculture, forestry and fisheries contribute to the achievement of sustainable development goals. It integrates the three dimensions of sustainable development: economic, social and environmental, by jointly addressing food security and climate challenges. It consists of three main pillars: sustainably increasing agricultural production and incomes, adapting and building resilience to climate change, reducing and/or removing greenhouse gas emissions where possible. Simply put, climate-smart agriculture is a collation of best management practices of adaptation, mitigation and resilience in all spheres of agriculture that tend to leave the smallest footprint on the planet. Climate change is already affecting global food production, and it will probably have even more of an impact in years to come. Carbon dioxide, a major greenhouse gas, is the primary cause of global warming. Human activity provides a major source of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. The rate of increase in global warming due to greenhouse gases is very unprecedented within the past 10,000 years and more. Plants need carbon dioxide to grow, so shouldn't more temperature and more carbon dioxide be a good thing for agriculture?
Carbon dioxide going up in the atmosphere, agriculture would all the crops would just be smiling and say, great, because high CO2 is good for photosynthesis. So that, in and of itself, it would be good.
Climate has an effect upon agriculture in several ways. One would be, in the case of the far north, you may have a longer growing season. And so areas presently where you can't grow certain crops because it's too cold or the growing season is too short, you might be able to grow these crops there as conditions warm up in those areas.
When we then add in the other effects of climate change, let's first just talk about higher temperatures. Then the story becomes more mixed.
While a warmer climate might mean some new growing regions, major agricultural areas may likely face losses. Scientists predict that in many areas on Earth there will be more droughts, more fires, and warmer temperatures, while a few places may experience cooler temperature, more rainfall, and more intense flooding. It is important to understand what climate-smart agriculture is. It is even more important to understand what climate change may do if we fail to address this great challenge. What are the implications, particularly on food and nutritional security, locally, regionally, and globally? Here is a feature on effects of climate change by the Food and Agriculture Organization.
1 out of every 8 people in the world is hungry and undernourished. Rising global temperatures will make it harder for everyone to have access to enough nutritious food, and those who are already poor and vulnerable will be most affected. The global challenges of hunger, nutrition, and climate justice are closely linked. The right kind of food helps build our immunity to disease and keeps us healthy. Without a balanced and nutritious diet and clean water, children can't develop fully, affecting the rest of their lives and the lives of their children. Climate change makes hunger and undernutrition worse in many different ways. Changes to the global climate can be sudden, like storms, or gradual, like sea level rise. Either way, vulnerable people are put at a greater risk of being hungry and malnourished. For many families, the rains haven't come when expected these last few years, and the hungry season is getting longer. Families struggle to find enough nutritious food. Women, who make up the majority of small-scale farmers, find it even harder to balance childcare, household duties, and farming. Droughts, floods, and unpredictable weather frequently force poor families to sell their livestock or other valuable goods to get by, leaving them even worse off. With poor harvests and smaller herds, less food is available and food prices are higher. It gets harder for families to afford nutritious food, and leaves people with even less to spend on education and healthcare. And without enough nutritious food, families go hungry and have less energy to fight diseases and infections such as malaria, cholera, and HIV. Everyone has to focus on keeping the family going.
While many families and societies struggle to finally understand the implications of climate change, many are already feeling the brunt.
The leaves are rolled. It means that they don't have water. Instead of 1 meter height, the maize is just about half a meter. This farmer here plants whenever the rains begin. And he knows when the rains begin normally. But now, because of climate change, he cannot tell anymore when the season really begins. So he's still depending on his old knowledge to do his farm. And every time he's getting it wrong. Not because he has done anything wrong, but because something else is happening. And he cannot determine the beginning part of the season correctly anymore.
There is no question that we are facing global challenges and it will require global solutions. While we continue to understand the complexity of the problem, it is more important to formulate solutions. Just recently, on the margins of the United Nations Climate Summit, a global alliance on climate-smart agriculture was launched. Examples of climate-smart agriculture: water harvesting captures runoffs for better crops, helping farmers adapt to erratic rainfall in dry areas. On-farm trees protect crops from wind, provide nutrients for their roots and leaves, and are a source of fodder for livestock. Did you know that agriculture, soil erosion, and deforestation together contribute a third of total greenhouse gas emissions? Well, climate-smart agriculture brings yet another benefit. It helps farmers capture carbon in the vegetation and in the soil as well. If farmers increase carbon in the soil, they can even earn money from carbon credit. So, climate-smart agriculture is a triple win. There's more food on the table, it helps the landscape to be more resilient to flood, and at the same time, plants and soil capture more carbon. Climate-smart agriculture is a path to green growth. Now is the time to take action. Climate-smart agriculture is a path to the climate change solution. As the agriculture sector faces a growing number of challenges, robust financial investments are needed to support the global food system. Agriculture now faces multiple challenges: an increased demand for food due to a growing population and change in diets, a leveling off of crop yields, and dwindling natural resources and biodiversity. The impacts of climate change bring additional threats to agriculture. A warming climate could cut crop yields by more than 35%, while the extreme weather events associated with climate change can have devastating effects on farmers, their land, and crops. Transforming the agriculture sector and building resilience will not be possible without significantly increasing the amount of capital available for climate-smart investments in agriculture. Access to finance has long been a challenge for agriculture due to perceptions of low profitability and high risks. More than ever, robust financial investments are needed to support the global food system. Here in Nigeria, a workshop was held to examine innovative ways to use climate finance to improve and increase access to finance for smallholder farmers and SMEs in the agricultural sector. while delivering positive climate outcomes, namely increased resilience and reduced emissions intensity. Let's join Mia Ogidi to tell us about it.
The ozone layer that naturally created to protect humanity from excess heat is undergoing mindless attacks from those it is protecting. It has assumed an alarming dimension to the extent those who caused the damage are regretting and paying dearly for it. Sadly, despite the obvious consequences of this regrettable act, many are yet to learn any lesson as the attack on the environment continue unabated. Yes, food security is the target of every government, but practices in the agricultural sector sponsors climate change. So, extreme weather condition, food infertility, and stagnated growth, as well as devastating flood, and lately cyclones of inexplainable proportion are the consequences. Governments across the globe now source for funds into a common pool in mitigating climate change from already depleted treasuries.
If the climatic trend continues the way it is in producing high temperature conditions, series of floods and droughts, agricultural productivity may be drastically reduced by up to about 25%.
Experts have raised a frightening alarm that if everyone sits on the fence and remain nonchalant to this attack from climate change till 2030, hunger may loom and human existence would be threatened. Climate change and agriculture are interrelated processes, both of which take place on a global scale. The unannounced presence of climate change manifests in unpredictable temperature levels, low or high, changes in rainfall patterns, changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide and ground-level ozone concentration, as well as emergence of pests and diseases. Climatologists like Professor Emmanuel Oladipo from the University of Lagos, Nigeria, are already afraid that climate change is affecting crop production in low-latitude countries, including Nigeria, and this will increase the risk of food insecurity for some vulnerable groups, such as the poor.
Whether we like it or not, no matter how much you plan, no matter how much money government pumps into agriculture, no matter how much money it pumps into water resources, no matter how much money it pumps into railway development, if the climatic conditions continue to change and provide some negative impact, like you spend about $1.6 billion on railway line, and may God forbid, one cyclone comes and takes all the railway lines away, it's gone. So we have to look at climate change, not just something that is negative, but something that when we understand it and we're able to adapt and respond to it, we'll be able to develop ourselves very well.
As you know, FAO in the recent estimate indicated that agricultural sector needs to produce 60% more food by 2050, this is a few years down the line. However, recent impact assessment indicates that by 2030, 9 out of every 10 of the 10 major crops that are stable for most people in the world, they will experience reduced or stagnated growth rates. The implication is that there will be dramatic increases in average prices of food due in part to climate change. So climate change is putting an extra additional pressure on agriculture if it is not addressed. One of the ways that have been touted to address climate change is to promote climate-smart agriculture or other climate innovations that are climate resilient and drive agriculture, actual transformation in the desired path. However, it's noted, just like has been alluded to earlier on, that less than 10% of global funding on climate or climate finance goes to the agricultural sector. Even much more less goes to the smallholder farmers who are least adapted, who are least able to support themselves in terms of climatic vulnerability. So one of the current activities that CTA is promoting is to work with national partners to identify what are the opportunities from the existing policy framework.
Agriculture, obviously, is one of the major emitters, and from the document under review, it's rated as the second emitter after energy. In our NDCs, agriculture is the first major emitter with the current NDCs. Obviously, it makes the situation even worse. It is an emitter, and it's also a sector that is one of the most vulnerable for us in the country to impacts of climate change. It's also a gathering for trying to get some kind of climate financing for the agri sector. And as you all know, the ministry on its own has tried its best to do innovative financing, we call it, under the Green Bonds program. As we know, issues of climate action and environment in general need a lot of financing, and government cannot do it all by itself. It's also commendable that we have this kind of collaboration with the organizers, because there is often a disconnect between what government is doing and what the academic world is doing. And this is a good example of bringing academic action to be streamlined into government action.
For each plant variety, for instance, there is an optimal temperature for negative growth dropping off as temperatures increase or decrease. Equally, there is a range of temperature at which a plant will produce seed. For instance, corn will fail to reproduce at temperature above 35 degrees Celsius, and soybeans cannot grow as expected when the temperature is above 38 degrees Celsius. Despite technological advances such as improved varieties, genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and irrigation systems, weather is still a key factor in agricultural productivity as well as soil properties. This is really a global burden and needs global approach. So, on Monday, May 6, 2019, the Technical Center for Agriculture and Rural Cooperation brought together climate change experts in Abuja, Nigeria, to come up with a framework on promoting climate finance for agriculture through nationally determined contribution processes in Nigeria.
Particularly in Nigeria, in our nationally determined contribution, it is one of the greatest emitters, contributing about 17%, particularly in the livestock sector. So essentially, we're saying if governments of the world will need to have deliberate effort, and that is why in the Paris Agreement, nations of the world sign the Paris Agreement, and so they made special contributions, what they call the nationally determined contributions of each nation, to tell us, well, give us an ambition of what you will do before 2030 in reducing the emission. And Nigeria has decided, well, if we don't have funding at all, we can contribute up to 20%. But if we have, that's what they call conditional requirements. If we have additional fundings from other nations, we should be able to, reduce by up to 45% the emission. So the greatest commitment of the world is through the Paris Agreement in tackling climate change. And one of the Sustainable Development Goals is to have zero hunger. Zero hunger, to reduce poverty by 2030, so to a zero level. So commitments in Nigeria, particularly through the nationally determined contribution, is saying, hey, we are committed to reducing our emission through the agricultural sector. And they are going to put a lot of strategies in place to achieving that.
Some of the measures is, first of all, to understand the trend of that climatic conditions and to see how we can adapt a lot of our productivity to respond to those changes. In some instances, for instance, while we talk about floods, in Asia now, there's a research that's ongoing, which is bringing out results that certain varieties of rice can be submerged for about 12 days in flood water, and they still come out and produce. So those are the type of what we call climate smart agriculture practices. Other varieties might be maybe our livestock. We look at them and see how we can reduce how much maintain their meat so that they can be fat but may not be using much of the energy to scratch out a lot of gases. So those are some of the things we can do to improve our productivity and at the same time make sure we adapt to the climatic changes that we're anticipating.
For these experts, the time for action is now, considering the facts on ground. For instance, by 2030, South Africa and some other African countries will lose 30% of its main crop, that is maize, while a report released by the Intergovernmental Committee on Climate Change indicates that the poorest countries would be the hardest hit, with reductions in crop yield in most tropical and subtropical regions due to decreased water availability, as most rainfall crops are near their maximum temperature tolerance, and yields are expected to drop sharply. But observations from global monitors on climate finance for agriculture indicate that nature is left to its own devices, as some countries are yet to make their financial contributions.
So much is expected from agriculture to produce food between now and 2030 and between now and 2050. But the finance that goes to agriculture is little. So you see there's a disconnect. So what we're doing here is to bring this together, both the environmentalists, the agriculturists, policymakers, and coming together to address this common issue.
Will Nigeria also be a victim of this struggle for supremacy between climate change and agriculture?
Well, basically, the approach is on policy, approach is also on governance, approach is also on funding. So these three key things is what government has been doing. We have already produced the instrument for intervention, which is the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution. And in that particular document, you will see that agri is a priority sector. Now, further to that, we have enhanced collaboration with these research institutions and also undertaking practical adaptation projects on the ground. If you look at the green bonds issuance, the first green bonds issuance, it targeted reforestation, which in itself is to improve the soil fertility as well as improved the forest cover of this country. Through that, you are taming or combating climate change because you are establishing additional sink that will curb these emissions of the greenhouse gases. Nigeria has benefited from the 100 billion facility with the Green Climate Fund. And most of the projects that have been approved for Nigeria are actually around the agricultural sector. So, and agri happens to be the major emitters of the greenhouse gases, and a lot of intervention also is going in that area. Bear in mind too also that it is the largest employer of labor. Most of our rural folks are farmers, and therefore government is really looking at that area very practically.
While efforts are on to provide food on the table through the modern techniques, systems that will promote environment-friendly practices to reduce gases that affect the ozone layer from the agricultural sector must be adopted.